Welcome back to PJ Takes 5. Today is Friday, August 1st, and we got something a little different here today. So breaking away from the normal show structure, like I said on Tuesday's episode, I'm moving this week, so just kind of in different places, getting everything reset up. This is the last video I'll have in this apartment, so probably a little bit different background next time I'm on camera, but I have to record this ahead of time, so can't really be reacting to news as it happens. So this is what I'm calling the first top 5 extravaganza. We're going to kind of rank stuff top 5. Obviously, power rankings and top 10, top 5 lists are a big part of sports media. I'm trying to stay away from kind of that stuff, just doing the top 5 quarterbacks, top 5 point guard, whatever list. So we're going to have a little bit of fun with that today, do a little bit of a take on that. Some stuff that really can't be proved in any way. But we'll see what happens here. I think this is going to be a good idea, kind of fun, kind of a little different. And all this is going to be football related, just because last night when you're watching this is the Hall of Fame game, so kind of start of the NFL season. So we're going to keep this kind of like a ramp up into football, if you will, specifically NFL football. So we'll just get started right away. So the first top 5 is top 5 yet to be inducted Hall of Famers. So these are 5 guys who aren't in the Hall of Fame, but I think they should be. So last night was obviously the Hall of Fame game, like I said. And this year's class is Eric Allen, Jared Allen, Antonio Gates, Sterling Sharp. So just 4 guys, pretty small class, but between those 4, a lot of really good football obviously being played throughout their careers. So starting with number 5 of top 5 guys that should be in the NFL Hall of Fame who aren't. First up, quarterback Eli Manning. He's probably the most controversial. There's the 2 Super Bowl wins against those Patriots teams, 2 Super Bowl MVPs, 4-time Pro Bowler. A little tough because he's got that 117 and 117 career record, so kind of a completely 500 average teams that he quarterbacked, which isn't always a quarterback stack, obviously, but it's not like him and the Giants were super competitive every single year. But he did have 2 different stretches of 3 consecutive 4,000-yard seasons, and he has the 11th most passing touchdowns and passing yards in NFL history. And everybody above him on those lists, if they're not currently playing, are in the Hall of Fame. So I know Eli Manning is a controversial one. Some will say that the Super Bowls, are more of a fluke and don't really define his career. But at the end of the day, to be a 2-time Super Bowl winning champion is still really impressive, and I think he needs to be in there. Number 4, Torrey Holt, another Super Bowl champion. There's here for the Rams back in the day. Had a first-team All-Pro nod, a second-team All-Pro nod, 7 different Pro Bowl selections. He led the league in receiving twice, which is impressive, and then he's got the 17th most yards all-time. So, part of those really explosive Rams teams that has a lot of Hall of Famers already, Orlando Pace and Marshall Faulk. And I think it's time to get Torrey Holt in there. Definitely a big part of that team's success and the offense's success specifically. Moving on down, we got number 3, Adam Vinatieri, kicker for the Patriots and the Colts. Obviously hard for any specialist to ever get in there. There's only a few, and Devin Hester was the first kind of punt returner brought in just pretty recently here, so always hard for a specialist to get in, but I think Adam Vinatieri's got a pretty clear case. 4 Super Bowl champions, 3 with New England, and then 1 with the Colts near the end of his career. 3 first-team All-Pro nods, 3 Pro Bowl nods in the same seasons. Part of the 100th anniversary team, part of the 2000s All-Decade team, and maybe most importantly, he has the most career points in the NFL, about 129 more than the next highest, who I think is Morton Anderson. Not rare for kickers to be at the top of the most scoring list, highest scoring list, just because PATs and field goals happen pretty frequently. But if you think 129 more than the next highest person, that's 43 field goals more. So that's a season and a half for a lot of kickers. So definitely makes sense to get Vinatieri in there. Number 2, Reggie Wayne, another great receiver for the Colts during their dynasty, the Super Bowl champ with them. Had 1 first-team All-Pro nod and 2 second-team All-Pro nods and 6 different Pro Bowl selections. He had an impressive 8 seasons, over 1,000 yards. That's just really good production at a really consistent level. And then the 10th most receiving yards all time. So another guy who's just at the top of those, career lists, doing it in an era not like today where, 16-game seasons, maybe a little more physical and less kind of catered to the offensive side of the ball. So Reggie Wayne obviously was part of the 1-2 punch there with Marvin Harrison Sr. Now, I guess, kind of. But definitely should be in there. And then just a couple honorable mentions. We'll try to throw in a couple different honorable mentions for each category here. But Kevin Williams, the Vikings D-tackle, 5 first-team All-Pro nods and was a member of the 2000s All-Decade team. Willie Anderson, old Bengals OT, 3 first-team All-Pros, very secure tackled in his day. Charles Tillman, who I know many Bears fans are familiar with. Whenever there's a move in football named after you, the peanut punch, I think, you kind of left a legacy on the game in a really positive way, and he should be considered. Marshall Yonda, Super Bowl champion with the Ravens at guard, 8-time Pro Bowler, part of the 2010 All-Decade team. And then Darren Woodson, Dallas Cowboys safety from the 90s, 3 Super Bowl champions with them during that dynasty, so really important player to their defense. And many of those guys and just people on the list in general were up for the Hall of Fame this year, and were finalists but didn't end up being selected. I think Tillman wasn't, and I don't think Kevin Williams was, and I don't think Eli Manning was, but everybody else on this list I think was a finalist. So probably in the next year or two, but number 1 on this list, Steve Smith Sr., the explosive and dynamic and trash-talking receiver from the Panthers, and then later with the Ravens. Earned 2 first-team All-Pro nods and 2 second-team All-Pro nods, and had 5 Pro Bowl selections throughout his career. Triple Crown winner in 2005. I think he tied for the league with receptions and or receiving yards. I know there's at least one tie in there, so it's not like a pure Triple Crown, but still, to be leading in all those categories is really impressive, and it's not something that happens a lot. We'll get more on the Triple Crown later, but definitely a rare achievement for a receiver, and one that only happens if if you're really dependable and really productive. And then he has the 8th most receiving yards ever, so just a little bit ahead of Reggie Wayne there. Definitely left a stamp in the game, and we'll see that he's probably in the Hall of Fame pretty soon here. Next up, kind of sticking with like the topic of like fives, takes 5 and 5 minutes per segment here. We're going with starting 5 offensive lines. So just the best offensive lines heading into the year, just not counting depth pieces, which are super important. I know it's really rare for any NFL team to have the same 5 guys up and down every single game, just between injuries and change of play and people moving from tackle to guard or vice versa. But for the purposes of this segment, we're just talking the starting 5s on paper. So first up, Kansas City Chiefs, left to right, we got Josh Simmons, their 2nd round pick, Kingsley Suamataia, Creed Humphrey, Trey Smith, and Jawan Taylor. So like I said, Simmons was their pick this year, one of the picks this year. He's probably going to end up starting over Jalen Moore, who was a free agent signing from the Niners. And then Kingsley Suamataia was the 2nd round pick a year ago. So, kind of in this middle part of the Chiefs dynasty, looking at Mahomes' age, right around 30. Makes a lot of sense to be kind of reinvesting in the offensive line, which they've done really well the past couple of years. Next up, we got the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Left to right again, Tristan Wirfs, Ben Bredesen, Graham Barton, Cody Mock, Luke Goetke. First, he's going to miss maybe the start of the season, currently on the PUP list. And the other guy that really stands out, Cody Mock, a 3rd-year guard out of North Dakota State University. Just one of those guys. There's another on this list here coming up who's from a smaller school. There were questions about how that would translate, maybe, skipping the kind of FBS, Division I step. And he's sidelined a bunch of those concerns, has turned into a really good player on that interior. Next up, we got the Chargers, Rashawn Slater, Bradley Bozeman, Zion Johnson, Mekhi Becton, Joe Alt. So recently, Rashawn Slater made some news re-signing on a 4-year, $114 million extension that I think makes him the highest paid O-line ever. So obviously they got a lot of trust in him. And then looking at that right side, they signed Mekhi Becton from the Eagles. He's 6'7", and then they drafted Joe Alt a year back, and he's 6'8". So just an insane amount of size on that right side, with Jim Harbaugh calling the plays there and dictating the offense there a little bit. Getting that really physical running game is so important, and it's hard to envision a more kind of picture perfect right side of that line. And then on the left side you have Rashawn Slater, one of the best pass blocking tackles in the league. So pass game, run game, left, right, I think they're a really sound group. Number 2, kind of not a big surprise, the Detroit Lions. Taylor Decker, Christian Mahogany, Tate Ratledge, Graham Glasgow, Penei Sewell. Kind of like Wirfs, Decker is currently on that PUP list, so he might miss a game or two to start the season, but really dominant group that's really helped kind of reframe that team moving forward and took them from one of the worst teams to one of the best teams in the league. And same with their D-line too, but obviously focus on O-line. And then Tate Ratledge, their rookie, kind of thrust into that starting center role potentially, and I don't think they really drafted him with the thought that he would be their starter this year, but then Frank Ragnow stepped back and retired, so throwing a lot at the rookie early, but I'm sure he's going to figure it all out. And they run, such great schemes, and they have such a great rushing attack in terms of, getting the running backs where they're supposed to be going and creating explosives everywhere and making sure defenses have to respect the pass game. So I think he'll slide in pretty seamlessly, and they'll be back to kind of their normal dominance in the NFC there. A couple honorable mentions. Buffalo with Deion Dawkins, David Edwards, Connor McGovern, Osiris Torrance, Spencer Brown. Torrance was a player I really liked coming out and has been really good, just, a real physical big guard. And then Deion Dawkins, one of the kind of more underrated tackles, and was a big champion for getting that NFL Offensive Lineman of the Year award going. So he's kind of like a stalwart left tackle there. The Broncos, Garrett Bowles, Ben Powers, Luke Wattenberg, Quinn Miners, Mike McGlinchey, kind of like Mock. Miners is that, smaller school guy who just has a lot of trash to him and is just not going to let anybody tell him that he's not good enough. Really, really good player, kind of out of nowhere in the college ranks. And then you got Garrett Bowles, who's been there, close to a decade, it feels like, and Mike McGlinchey, who they got from the Niners, who's another kind of really big, really tall, really lanky tackle. So it's a good group in front of Bo Nix as he heads into year 2. Jets, also an honorable mention. They've just invested so much into that offensive line. Ollie Fashanu, John Simpson, Joe Tittman, Elijah Vera Tucker, Elmar Membu. 3 first-round picks within the past 4 or 5 years, and then Joe Tittman's a second-rounder. So a bunch of really athletic guys. I know Membu just this past year was a draft pick, and they brought in Justin Fields behind them. Probably the best O-line that he's really had to work behind. So I expect big things from them. I think they're a younger group, so it might not happen right away, and there might be a little bit trying to figure out, is this guy a better tackle or guard? Is he a better on the left side or the right side? But that's a pretty talented group and a pretty highly built one. And then the Vikings, Christian Darrisaw, a left tackle, Donovan Jackson, Ryan Kelly, Will Freeze, Brian O'Neill. Donovan Jackson was their pick this year. And then Darrisaw's been around for a couple years out of Virginia Tech, I believe. He's, another really kind of underrated left tackle that gets more than the job done, and people don't really consider in the upper echelon of NFL tackles. And he's still kind of in the younger prime part of his career, so he's only going to get better if he can stay healthy here. And then they had Ryan Kelly and Will Freeze coming both in the Colts there this offseason. So really kind of just, hitting it over and over again with, making sure we have kind of a constant flow of really talented and experienced players coming in for them. And then Brian O'Neill, shouldn't go unmentioned. He's another really good right tackle, pretty dominant out on the edge there. And then number 1, not really a big surprise, Philadelphia Eagles. From left to right, Jordan Mailata, Landon Dickerson, Cam Jurgens, Tyler Steen, Lane Johnson. So the big billing is the tackles, which very cool stories for both of them. Lane Johnson has just been like a dominant tackle, probably a future Hall of Famer. He was a 4th overall pick back in his day, so kind of the prototypical highly drafted guy. And then Jordan Mailata, a really different path. Old rugby player, was a 7th round pick, just a massive 6'8" human being. And it's cool to see that they've found success in maybe the best offensive tackle pairing this season and maybe even in recent history. Just 2 completely different ways of going about it. And then Landon Dickerson, their 2nd round pick a couple years back, kind of slotting into that left guard spot after that ligament injury in college. I know he's played some center for them. But the Eagles stick out because they've just done such a good job of rehauling that unit over and over again. And then moving on down the list here, we got best players to wear number 5. So I always kind of like jersey numbers and what goes into a number. And with the new rules a couple years back, single-digit numbers are open to more than just quarterbacks or specialists. So it's interesting to see kind of who's gravitated towards what positions. I'll tell you before we get into this list, it seems like a lot of receivers have kind of picked up 5, and that makes sense. I always think a speedy guy might look a little faster in the single-digit number. But the number 5 ranked guy who wears number 5, David Montgomery, running back for the Lions. Old Bear, moved to the Lions. This is going to be his 3rd season. Really important part of that running game alongside the offensive line we just talked about. But 6 straight seasons of 1,000+ all-purpose yards, 55 total touchdowns, including 25 over his past 2 seasons combined. So really productive and getting into the end zone a lot. Has the 5th most touchdowns since 2019 when he entered the league. And interestingly enough, he's actually never made the Pro Bowl. So I think he was such an important part of those Bears offenses. And then, kind of like the real downhill force of the Lions offense. Obviously, they got Jahmyr Gibbs kind of taking over as more of the 1, 2, 3 down back. But Montgomery's still a very important part and kind of gets their attitude set as a physical attacking football team. So I was kind of surprised that he never made a Pro Bowl. Number 4 on the list, like I said, a receiver wearing 5, Drake London down in Atlanta. Kind of had a breakout season last year, had career highs in receptions with 100, yards with a little over 1,200, and then TDs with 9. So kind of really took that step when Kirk Cousins came in, and then Michael Penix kind of took over there. Had the 4th most receiving yards last year, tied for the 7th most touchdowns. And with him, just a couple of years in Atlanta, he's already played with 5 different quarterbacks. So heading into year, I think 4 with Michael Penix returning, there should be a little more consistency and maybe see him at a higher level. I know you got Darnell Mooney in there taking some targets. You got Kyle Pitts. They're always trying to kind of get going there. So it's not like he has nobody to compete with at that pass catcher spot, but big physical body that should be coming into his own a little bit here more and more, and we'll see how much better he gets. Number 3, still a guy who produces at a high level, but kind of like a legacy pick, Jalen Ramsey. 3-time first-team All-Pro, 7 Pro Bowls. He missed last year for the first time since a rookie season. Tied with the 9th most interceptions since 2021. So over the past few years, still a lot of production. He hit 13 over that span, and 24 career interceptions, which is the 8th most over that span. So, it's tough with corners and DBs because sometimes you're so good that people don't even throw at you, but he's found a way to stay productive. Obviously, he's with the Steelers this year. They traded for him out of Miami. I don't know if he's necessarily going to be a boundary corner. They got Darius Slay and Joey Porter Jr., who's, kind of an inside-outside versatility guy. So Ramsey is, he might be playing some safety. He might be playing some of that kind of star robber position, just kind of lurking those crossing routes. But he should be a big part of that defense, which is already, so good up front, and kind of just some more relief in the back end and definitely some more veteran kind of perspective. So I think he's going to have a really good year, and this year and however long he wants to play. Number 2 on this list, another receiver, Garrett Wilson, out with the Jets, offensive rookie of the year, and he came out 3 years over 1,000 receiving yards since 2022. He's had the 10th most receiving yards and the 8th most catches. And kind of like Drake London, a young guy who's played through a lot of adversity. He's had 6 different quarterbacks in his time in New York. Justin Fields coming in. Hopefully those two can kind of reconnect to the Ohio State days and be a little consistent year to year. But just another player who's really productive, a really integral part of that offense. They don't have as much pass catching help outside of him as maybe the Falcons do with London. So he's been I know they had Devontae Adams in years past, but Wilson's kind of been their number 1 from the jump. I don't expect that to slow down anytime soon. Just a really good player. And some honorable mentions, T. Higgins out with the Bengals, kind of like that super 2 receiver. He could be a 1 on different teams, but behind that Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase connection, he's kind of just there at number 2. So he gets his shots, and he's a really, really talented player. Kayvon Thibodeau, D-end, outside linebacker, up for the Giants, number 5. Productive player who kind of might be the odd man looking in when you think about they just picked up Abdul Carter and they got Brian Burns from the Panthers a little bit back. So he might get phased out a little bit, might come in on different packages, 3rd and 8, and you got all 3 of those guys coming up off the edge and 1 in the middle. I think that's a lot to deal with. He's uber athletic, kind of outside linebacker, just, waiting to kind of put it all together, and I think we're probably on the brink of that. Jalen Petrie out with the Texans, safety up there, had a really good first season. Maybe hasn't matched that production quite since, but part of that just humming Texans defense that plays so aggressively, and you can only play that aggressive when you have trusted players in the back end, especially at safety. So D'Amico Ryans is comfortable sending all these guys on blitzes and just hammering the quarterback, knowing that you got somebody like Petrie on the back end who's going to make up for any errors or kind of compensate for that lack of space being taken up. So another really important player, just didn't quite make the list. And then Jabril Peppers with the Patriots, another safety. He played everything at Michigan a while back, if you remember that. Again, with the Patriots, they're kind of in that rebuilding phase a little bit with Drake May coming in, but with Mike Vrabel as a head coach and kind of retooling that defense and making sure they're really sound. I'm sure he's going to be kind of like the veteran presence for that back end, especially with you got Christian Gonzalez on the edge there at defensive back, cornerback. But Jabril Peppers is definitely an important part. And the number 1, kind of an obvious pick, Jaden Daniels, quarterback for the Washington Commanders. Definitely a little bit of positional bias here just because a quarterback is so important. And obviously Daniels hasn't been doing it long, just 1 year in, but so productive last year. Offensive Rookie of the Year winner, was a Pro Bowler, a little over 3,500 passing yards and about 900 rushing yards for 31 total touchdowns. And he led Washington to their first 12-win season since 1991. So just came in and was immediately an important part of that team and that offense. And they got a lot of change going from the year before into last season, bringing in Dan Quinn and kind of a change of ownership and so many different guys and kind of like 1 year smaller term contracts, but kind of those like bridge journeyman veteran players who are going to make a lasting impact on those young guys like Daniels, but maybe not be around for the long haul. So it'll be a little different year to year for Jaden Daniels. Obviously, they really need to re-sign McLaurin to get him, those two kind of set up for the next handful of years here. But it'd be hard to put anybody above Daniels. I mean, he seems to kind of flip the light switch for the Commanders since day one, and I'm a little hesitant to say that it's going to be like quite as similar this season, just because, obviously one against the Bears, but against the Cowboys, there are a couple games in there, just so many last minute kind of wins, and it's just kind of hard to bet on all those things going your way again. But you would definitely want to have that as a rookie to see all that success, just so that you can kind of, get a taste for it. They were in championship team last season, so he's hungry to get back and get even further. And obviously with the Eagles in division, they've got the work cut out for them. But in my book, best player wearing number 5. This one, next on the list, top 5 players entering year 5, which is kind of just a cheap way to say guys from the 2021 NFL draft. So you think people who are getting new deals right now, up for new deals right now, playing on the 5th-year option, maybe they're on their second team. But these are 5 guys from what, looking back, is actually like a star-studded 21 draft class. So it was really hard to kind of pick everybody out, maybe including with who was going to be number 5. But I put Creed Humphrey, Chief Center, 63rd overall pick, has started all 81 games in the regular season and postseason, and that includes 4 AFC Championship appearances, 3 Super Bowls, and then winning 2 of those Super Bowls. First team All-Pro last season, second team All-Pro in 2022, 3 Pro Bowls, 123 team sacks allowed since he joined the league, which is the 3rd fewest. So sacks allowed might not be like a center stat necessarily, but he has so much onus in trying to get everybody set up and making sure the communication is strong. I know people will say at quarterback, it's so important because that's the player who touches the ball every play. Well, center is the same thing. He touches the ball every single play, and he has to kind of help, communicate with, guys to the left and guys to the right, make sure he's listening to the quarterback. I think there's so much mentally that goes into being a center, let alone the physical ability of, snapping the ball and immediately having to put hands up and get hands on somebody. And Creed Humphrey has quickly become maybe the best center in the game, so definitely worth the shout here. And yeah, number 5 overall. Number 4, we got Pat Surtain, the second from the Denver Broncos, cornerback. He was the 9th overall pick. Defensive Player of the Year last year, 2-time first team All-Pro, 3 straight Pro Bowls. He's had 11 interceptions in his career, which is tied for the 13th most over that span. Less than 2,000 yards receiving allowed, which is about 30 yards per game. So super stingy DB. One of those last waves of Nick Saban, Alabama DBs, who I covered all those guys very highly. I think they just kind of see the game in a different way, coming with that Alabama experience. But Surtain just so unbelievable at that cornerback spot. It's such kind of a fleeting position where the prime and the super high prime can be so fleeting at times. And not to say he's not going to be good for the next several years, but I'd say right now probably the best cornerback in the NFL. That could change very quickly, but for a top 10 pick at cornerback, I'd say the Broncos got their money's worth and are continuing to kind of reap the benefits from his leadership and his ability on that revamped defense that's kind of helping them take over and find the next steps under Bo Nix at quarterback. Number 3, we got Micah Parsons, 12th overall pick in the draft. So Defensive Rookie of the Year in his first season, 2 first-team All-Pro nods, a second-team All-Pro nod, Pro Bowl every year he's been in the NFL, 52.5 sacks in his career, which is the 5th most in that span, and he's had at least 12 sacks all 4 seasons, including 12 last season when he played only 13 games, so almost a sack a game. Obviously in the news right now and trying to get that contract extension worked out, and the Cowboys and Jerry Jones have been, less than helpful in those negotiations, to put it lightly. But just a super impressive edge rusher, just screaming off. He's kind of that lighter style, so it can be a little bit tougher in the run game. I know he can get washed out a little bit when a team just decides we're going to run, at you, put a tight end in your lap and a fullback coming to hit you. But that's not really the player he ever was built as, just that super elite, kind of like we said Abdul Carter earlier, that number 11 Penn State edge rusher, which I know has kind of a legacy in its own right of being that screamer and that uber athletic guy off the edge. So Parsons definitely fits that billing. And yeah, 3 on this list, 3 out of his entire draft class makes him a really important player in the NFL, regardless of what team he's on. But with the Cowboys, obviously going to be in the attention a lot here. Number 2, Penei Sewell, right tackle for the Lions, 7th overall pick. So started all but one game. He missed, I think, the Week 17 game as a rookie. First team All-Pro each of the past 2 seasons, 3 Pro Bowls each of the last 3 seasons, 124 sacks allowed as a team is the 4th fewest in that span, and the 6th most rushing yards in that span, and the 3rd most total yards. So he's been a big part of kind of rehauling that offensive line, especially like we talked about earlier. Been a big part of rehauling that team in general. I see here that since he's come on, they've had 39 regular season wins, and to put that in the context, the Lions had 39 regular season wins in the 6 seasons prior to his arrival. So they're winning at like a 1.5x clip than they were before he got there. Super important player, tackles always are, but Panay is definitely like the tone setter on that right side. Just elite player. Really can't say much more on the fact that they probably made the right decision for that kind of Dan Campbell, really physical brand of football to go out and get that right tackle year in and year out. You know what you're getting. All-star player. Just put his head down and work. Definitely a great pick for the Lions and who they've become. Some honorable mentions here. Penei Sewell's teammate, Amon-Ra St. Brown, was the 4th round pick, 112th overall. Just uber productive, mostly kind of a slot player, but such an important part of that offense. He's been a first team All-Pro each of the past 2 seasons, a Pro Bowler each of the last 3, 430 receptions in his career, tied for the 1st in that span. 4,851 yards is the 7th most in that span, and 33 touchdowns is tied for the 6th in that span. So producing at a league high kind of level in the upper echelon. And along with Panay was just a big part of kind of rehauling that offense, giving Jared Goff, a guy to rely on day in and day out. And then it's also worth knowing that the Lions also picked Levi Onwuzurike and Aleem McNeil, 2 defensive tackles who are not quite as important as Panay Sewell is to the offensive line, but still hammering those trenches, and that's a big part of who the Lions are today. So you can see those impressions kind of getting set in the 2021 class. The Chiefs, they picked Humphrey. They also picked Trey Smith. So kind of like the Lions, hammering into those trenches, making sure that you have a lot of security there. Another successful team, the Eagles, picked Devontae Smith, Landon Dickerson, and Milton Williams. So star receiver, but then come back with 2, big trench players. Milton Williams left for the Patriots this offseason, but Dickerson, like we talked earlier, a big part of probably the best offensive line in the NFL. And then the Niners, another team who didn't have the great season last season, but they're a successful team who's going to be in the case more years than not. They picked up Diamador Lenore, Talanoa Hufanga, and Elijah Mitchell, all late round picks, but that just kind of shows you that if you want to be that successful team year in and year out, you have to find those guys in the later rounds who, when you're playing week 17, 18, 19, 20, end of the regular season into the postseason, you have young guys who are kind of coming on and finding themselves, they can plug in and get the most out of. And those 3 guys from this class were really important to get that kind of ethos for the Niners in the past couple of years. A couple more honorable mentions just because there are so many good guys from this draft class, like really insane. 2 starting quarterbacks still, Trevor Lawrence, 1st overall pick, and then Justin Fields, who was with the Bears, and then the Steelers, and now the Jets. Couple big pass catchers, Kyle Pitts, who, I think people are a little disappointed in, but still, pretty productive tight end. Jalen Waddle, big receiver for the Dolphins. Nico Collins, a big physical receiver for the Texans. And then Pat Freiermuth, a reliable tight end for the Steelers. O-lineman Rashawn Slater, who we talked about earlier, one of the best tackles in the NFL. Elijah Vera Tucker for the Jets, a real, can play like all 5 positions on the line. Christian Darrisaw for the Vikings, and then Quinn Miners again for the Broncos. So, it's not a coincidence that all those guys play for an O-line that we talked about earlier in top 5 O-lines. I mean, those are all really essential players, and some offer versatility, and some are better run blockers and pass blockers, or vice versa. But all have been doing their thing and deserve the shout here. And then just the last few mentions. Gregory Rousseau, DN for the Bills, has been stellar. Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah for the Browns. Had that big injury coming out of Notre Dame, but has become a really good player. And then DBs, J.C. Horn for the Panthers, Greg Newsome for the Browns, and Tyson Campbell for the Jaguars. All kind of like, Horn was a top 10 pick, I think, and then the other 2 are kind of end of the 1st round, early 2nd round, but big outside boundary cornerbacks. But then number 1, it's hard to debate. Jamar Chase, receiver for the Bengals, 5th overall pick, won Offensive Rookie of the Year, first team All-Pro last season, second team All-Pro as a rookie, Pro Bowl every year, Triple Crown last year. He put up 127 receptions, 1,700 yards, and 17 touchdowns. So you think that's basically averaging 100 yards a game and a touchdown a game. Since 1990, only Jerry Rice, Sterling Sharp, Steve Smith Sr., and Cooper Kupp have won that. So to get that done that early in his career is unbelievable. And kind of a note here, over the past 2 seasons, just 1 fumble loss. So big ball security, really kind of more physical than your mind might kind of give him credit for. And then since he's gotten into the NFL, 395 receptions is 6th best, 5,400 yards is 3rd best, and 46 touchdowns leads the NFL. So just super productive, in that reunion with Joe Burrow there. Definitely a big part of their offense, and obviously another guy who got a contract this offseason, as some of those guys did on that list. And then moving on down the list here, our last topic here, we're going to do quarterbacks for next year's quarterback show. So this is kind of just a way to say like quarterback storylines I'm most interested in. I watched quarterback show this past weekend. I'll do a little bit of review at the end here. But just a really cool way to kind of get inside the mind and daily life of an NFL starting quarterback, which is such an insanely difficult job. You see on Sundays, but then seeing everything they do kind of off the field, it gives you an even higher level of respect for what they do week in and week out. So these are my 5 guys that I really want to see. My only stipulations: no rookies. I think that's like kind of unfair to a rookie to have a Netflix crew following them around. I'd rather not see somebody like in a competition, just because if you set out and say like we're gonna follow Anthony Richardson and then Daniel Jones beats him out, that doesn't really become a super interesting subject. I know that happened to Marcus Mariota in the first season they did the show, and it was just kind of tough, and I think they kind of phased out his plot line near the end, and then no repeats. So the guys we've had, like I said, Mariota, Joe Burrow, Jared Goff, Kirk Cousins, and Patrick Mahomes. I think Cousins is the only guy who's repeated. Did it 1 year with the Vikings and then recently with the Falcons. But I just want to see new guys in there to make it a little more interesting. So number 5, I have Geno Smith, Raiders quarterback. He's a really interesting character. Tom Brady comes in as the minority owner. Pete Carroll signs on, kind of out of a quasi-retirement to be the head coach. And the first big franchise move that they make as a duo is to bring in Geno Smith. I think that just speaks so highly of who he is as a quarterback and a person, and just a huge stamp of approval. He's had 5 seasons with Pete Carroll in Seattle there, so they know each other very well, and there'll be no learning curve with like who this coach is and what he's all about. And he just got such an interesting story. 7 seasons in between his last season as a starter for the Jets and then becoming the starter for the Seahawks. Taking over after Russell Wilson left. And as good as he is on the field, I think I'd be more interested just to see, like, he's such a good orator of some of the best, like, football quotes of the past couple of years, kind of like a Jameis Winston-esque, style of, like, just saying crazy stuff that's really cool. The big one, they wrote me off, but I didn't write back, in that postgame with the Seahawks after they beat Russell Wilson in his return. He said, quote, "My tough times will be a dream to somebody else." That's just a crazy thing to say as a quarterback. And then he also said recently, quote, "I didn't come to roll the dice in Vegas. I came to run the table." Just an insane amount of confidence. It's easy to talk, but he definitely walks the walk, and he'd be a super interesting guy to get inside the mind of a little bit for the Raiders. Number 4, kind of a homer pick, Caleb Williams. A lot of national focus and pressure on him entering year 2 with Ben Johnson. I know a lot of people kind of say that he didn't do anything as a rookie. I think 3,500 yards, 20 touchdowns, and just 6 interceptions is impressive regardless of the situation. But taking into account everything that the Bears had going wrong last year, I think the fact that he was productive and limited mistakes in a pretty big way is like super impressive. And just kind of not the type of football that he's used to playing necessarily. So I thought he had a pretty good rookie season, all things considered, and something that should only get better. But obviously Ben Johnson coming in, you got that like Ben Johnson effect, kind of, ironing out some of that dysfunction maybe that he's had to deal with last year and just in the entire process. And I also think he's a guy who's had his story told, but hasn't really been able to tell his story, if that makes sense. Obviously that Seth Wickersham book kind of made headlines this offseason, and the conversation was about they were going to pull on Eli and, deny getting drafted by the Bears, and that might be true. That didn't happen, obviously. But it'd be cool for him to get in front of the camera and kind of say his piece. Obviously, they were on Hard Knocks last year, so we did a little bit of that. But at the end of the day, that show is edited by the franchise. I just think he's a super charismatic and gregarious individual, and gets a lot of kind of flack for that when it should be kind of more celebrated that you have a guy who can play and think and process at such a high level, but is also, has a big personality off the field as well. Speaking of big personalities off the field as well, we got number 3 Baker Mayfield. Another guy who's had like a really cool and different journey despite being a first overall pick. So went to Cleveland and then the Panthers and then the Rams and then the Bucks. With the Rams, he came in after like 2 days of being signed with the team and started a late season game for them and actually navigated and commanded a 16-3 fourth quarter comeback. So just a crazy guy. I mean, we all know his kind of journey of being a walk-on at Texas Tech and then going to Oklahoma and winning the Heisman. But with the Bucs, he's really been nothing short of amazing. I mean, he led Tampa Bay to division titles each of the last 2 seasons. So kind of picking up right where Tom Brady left that team off. He's had over 4,000 yards each of the past 2 seasons, 41 touchdowns last season. Just a classic case of like you invest in a guy for 1 overall, and you give up on him so early, and he's kind of proven a lot of the doubters wrong. And I think it'd be really interesting just to kind of get a glimpse into like his daily life, because he is that kind of outward and chip on his shoulder kind of guy who it'd be interesting to get kind of just a little bit of perspective inside his mind. Number 2, very different personality from him, but quarterback Justin Herbert for the Chargers. He's like that toolsy quote unquote quarterback who kind of has all the physicals to work with, but it just hasn't translated into wins on the field, and that's not all his fault. Obviously, he's got a 41-38 regular season record. There was some coaching stuff with Brandon Staley early in his career. I know he hasn't had like the best receivers throughout his career. The defenses let him down here and there. 0-2 in the playoffs, including that 21-point collapse against the Jaguars. But he enters a year where his lead receivers are Ladd McConkey, who's a really good kind of slotty player, Quentin Johnson, who's had some problems, Trey Harris, a rookie, Will Dissly, and Tyler Conklin at tight end. So not like a big name receiver to kind of lean on. They got some good, like I said, the O-line is amazing, and they picked up Omarion Hampton to be like kind of lead down running back. So he's in an interesting spot where they're not asking him to be like a 5,000-yard passer by any stretch of the imagination, and to be a true quarterback and lead that offense in its entirety. But I think, between him and Harbaugh, seeing that relationship and just seeing, who he is and learning more about Justin Herbert would be super interesting, I think. I know he's always kind of in that like top 5, top 7, top 10 conversation. And it's hard to kind of pinpoint where he is just because that success hasn't been there, but definitely a player that I'm really interested in and I think is really good. A couple honorable mentions. I think really just Matthew Stafford and Aaron Rodgers, kind of for the same reason. So they turned 38 and 42 this winter respectively. And the narrative is like, are they in the last season? Is the last handful of seasons? How long are they going to play for? They're both looking for a second Super Bowl ring to kind of cement that legacy. Obviously, they're probably both Hall of Famers, but that jump from 1 Super Bowl to 2, I think, is pretty substantial and would do a lot for both of them. Like I said, probably both first ballot Hall of Famers. They entered the season, so Stafford and Rodgers, 10th and 7th in yards and 10th and 5th in touchdowns. By the end of the year, that's probably going to be like 7th or 6th and 5th, and then 9th and 4th in touchdowns. So guys who are already high on those lists of like the big statistics and numbers, but are probably just going to keep going up and up and up, especially just this year alone. Other names that I could be interested in, Josh Allen, obviously the reigning MVP, one of the best players. I would assume that doesn't really happen just because like there's the whole like married to Haley Steinfeld thing. They probably want a little more privacy than that, but super interesting guy, and I think really kind of funny and charismatic dude that would be cool to watch throughout a season. Trevor Lawrence, kind of like Baker, kind of a forgotten first overall pick. Obviously, he hasn't had that career trajectory of moving around a lot, but will be interesting to see what day in the life is in Jacksonville. And obviously they have Brian Thomas Jr. and Travis Hunter to work with, so he could be looking for that kind of outbreak or breakout season. And it'd be interesting to kind of remind everybody that Trevor Lawrence is like an amazing quarterback who had nothing but success before joining the Jaguars. CJ Stroud, kind of had that first big first year, and then kind of fell down a little bit last season. But it'd be interesting to kind of see what his process is like, as a younger quarterback. Same with Bryce Young, kind of the opposite, where really struggled as a rookie and then kind of found his way a little bit last season. It'd be cool to see him on the national stage and just kind of see everything that he's about, Heisman winner, but also being such a kind of different physical quarterback than a lot of guys. And then last, I'll mention Sam Darnold. Had that kind of resurgent year with the Vikings last year, knowing that it probably wasn't going to be the long-term situation just because J.J. McCarthy was kind of waiting around. So he goes up to Seattle, back on the West Coast. Jackson Smith and Jigba, Cooper Kupp up there. I think it'd be interesting just to kind of see how he does and if he can kind of keep all that going from last season. Obviously, he kind of struggled in his last game or two there with the Vikings, but he's got some good momentum, kind of more so than he's had in recent years, and seeing if he can kind of call on that and extend that would be super interesting. But then number one, I don't even think it's that difficult. Lamar Jackson, two-time MVP, but he's got that pressure to succeed in the postseason, so that'd be a really interesting kind of plot line following the Ravens, assuming they get into the playoffs, how far they can go. He's had 5 playoff appearances in 6 seasons and 3 division titles, but only the 1 AFC championship appearance, so like I said, just that narrative of like how far can you take the Ravens, I think would be super interesting. He's, obviously with the legs, unbelievable player. Started his career with 5 straight seasons as a starter, as being the team's leading passer and rusher. But weirdly, he's like underrated, which is crazy to say for a 2-time MVP. But he just doesn't get that respect that he deserves as a passer. I mean, really, really, really good passer, especially from inside the pocket. And people don't really give him that credit. So kind of talking about that narrative will be interesting, and seeing everything that goes into being able to be that type of quarterback, I think will be awesome. And then just kind of like a different note, he actually doesn't have an agent or any real like management representation. I know a lot of that is done through his family and his mom specifically. So he's kind of not the most like publicly out there quarterback, not a lot of brand deals and stuff. So it'd be cool just to kind of get him on that national stage more, to see Lamar Jackson, the person. Obviously everybody's pretty familiar with Lamar Jackson, the player. But to get his face and name and personality out there a little more, I think would be pretty beneficial to him, and it'd be really cool. I think he's such a different type of person, and getting him out there would be awesome to watch. So that's all my top 5s. Not really a media review this week. I'll talk a little bit about quarterback. The last season I watched this past weekend, like I said, it was Joe Burrow, Jared Goff, and Kirk Cousins. Obviously, Jared Goff led the Lions to an incredible season, and they fell a little bit short in the playoffs. But just to see everything that goes into, having that pressure week in and week out, I think was super interesting. Goff is, like I said, with some of these guys, another one of those first overall pick, highly drafted guys who they just kind of gave up on a little bit early. And obviously it worked for the Rams, who won the Super Bowl with Stafford after they traded him. But, Goff was kind of thrown away a little bit there to Detroit. And I think he and that team in general have really kind of taken that slight personally and have made that part of their identity. So that was really cool to see. Joe Burrow obviously have like an MVP caliber season, except for the lack of team success was pretty apparent and glaring. So kind of following that journey, I think they were 4-8, and they're a lot. They go on a crazy run, winning every week until that last week, and they don't get into the playoffs because I think Denver beats KC or something. I can't remember. But just crazy to see like his stress and pressure week to week, knowing that you have to win to stay alive, and that he's one of those like top, however many quarterbacks in the NFL, and he needs to get to the playoffs to continue to prove that to himself, and obviously for the benefit of his teammates. And he's such a different guy, doing like the fashion show stuff, and he was talking about buying the Batman car, and then his home got burglarized. He's just like a really kind of not the like super vocal rah kind of guy. I mean, he does speak up and gets passionate about stuff. That was apparent, but just a really interesting human being. And it was cool to watch him. And then Kirk Cousins, obviously kind of was rolling there, and then got a little banged up and led to struggling a little bit. And obviously they had Michael Penix waiting in behind him. So not that they had a short leash, but you thought that they would get Penix in there at some point, despite Kirk signing that 4-year contract last offseason. But kind of different just because Kirk, he's a little bit older. He's got a couple kids, so he's like in a different part of his life. But we're all familiar with the like Great Clips haircuts and the Cole's Cash stuff. Very like kind of Midwestern, salt of the earth kind of guy. And it was interesting to see like just kind of how to balance that life with the life of being an NFL quarterback. And sometimes those are very congruent and sometimes they're not. I know he was talking about the phone call that Raheem Morris said that he was getting benched for Penix, and having to talk to his kids after, who were asking like, oh, well, they cut you, right? And it's like trying to explain that to a young kid, 5 years old, like, no, I'm just on the bench, but I still have to be a teammate and I still have to be there for Michael Penix. I thought it was a really interesting kind of glimpse into like that side of football, that these are people's lives, and decisions don't just affect one person, but they affect a person and his wife, Julie Cousins, and their kids, and his brother and his friends. They kind of make appearances throughout the show. So I left the show bigger fans than all three of those guys, and I like them all going into it, so that should really tell you something. For a rating, I'll give it, I think, an 8.9. I mean, I'm biased because I just love that kind of football content and seeing those guys in a different light and seeing the behind the scenes of all that stuff, but I thought it was a little better than the first season just because that first season they had Marcus Mariota in there who kind of got benched and stepped away from the team, and that got all convoluted. But yeah, I really liked it. Couldn't recommend it high enough. I think I was a little late on it. It came out earlier this summer, but those are my top 5 guys for who I'd want to be on that quarterback show, and those are my top 5 for all those lists. So, like I said, just had to get a little creative just because I couldn't really record an episode on Thursday night. Obviously, by the time you watch this on Friday, last night would have just been the Hall of Fame game and then the MLB trade deadline. So nothing about either of those in here. So if Aaron Judge gets traded and I don't have anything to say about it, that is unfortunate. If there's a 99-yard touchdown in a Hall of Fame game, that's unfortunate, but it is what it is. When I see you guys next Tuesday, I'll be in a different setup. Not that the setup behind me right now is anything special, just my beige wall and a door, but it'll look a little different. So I'm staying in Chicago, moving to a different apartment, and I'll be there for the foreseeable future. So hopefully this is the last time I have to do something kind of pre-recorded like this, and the rest of the time can just be about reacting to stuff in the news, which I think is a little more interesting. But like I said, just had this idea of something creative. Obviously the number 5 is kind of like a theme in the show, so I was hoping to maybe hold this for like 50th episode if we get that far, some like milestone or some holiday or something a little unique, and I had to kind of pull it out here just because scheduling conflict. But we all live in the real world. We know that stuff happens. So that's it for me. I hope you guys like the first ever top 5 extravaganza, as I call it. And yeah, we'll be back Tuesday with a regular show. So thanks so much. Peace.